Sofia Bellandi's fingers were slick with blood that wasn't hers, pressing down hard against the wound in a stranger's chest, while the diner's fluorescent lights flickered above them like a heartbeat monitor going haywire. "Stay with me," she said, her voice cracking as she leaned her full weight into her palms, feeling the warmth pump out between her fingers, no matter how hard she pressed. "Don't you dare close your eyes. Look at me." The man beneath her had eyes so dark they looked black, and even now, even with a bullet lodged somewhere near his collarbone, he was looking at her like she was the only thing in the room that made sense. "You shouldn't have done that," he rasped, his hand closing weakly around her wrist. His grip was strong even in pain, calloused, heavy with rings, the kind of hand that had done things she couldn't imagine. "You don't know who I am." "I know you're bleeding out on my shift," Sofia snapped, glancing toward the door where two more men in dark suits had just burst in, guns raised, sweeping the room like they'd done this before. "And I know, if you don't shut up and let me hold this pressure, you're going to die on a diner floor that hasn't been mopped since Tuesday." Somewhere behind her, glass shattered. A woman screamed. The bell above the diner door, the one that always jingled cheerfully when regulars came in for their Sunday pancakes, jingled again now, except this time it was punctuated by another gunshot, splintering the window behind the counter into a spiderweb of cracks. Sofia didn't remember deciding to throw herself in front of him. 1 second she'd been refilling his coffee, telling him the pie of the day was cherry, watching him almost smile at her the way no customer ever did. The next, she'd seen the black car pull up outside, seen the man in the doorway raise something metallic and dark, and her body had simply moved before her mind caught up, throwing itself between the stranger at table 6 and whatever was coming for him. If you're the kind of person who believes some moments change your life forever, hit subscribe now, because Sofia had no idea this one was about to change everything. "Talk to me," she said again, softer now, her curls falling loose from her ponytail and sticking to her damp forehead. "What's your name?" "Just tell me your name." His jaw tightened, even bleeding, even trapped beneath a woman he'd met 20 minutes ago. He hesitated like the answer was a weapon in itself. "Salvatore," he finally said. "Okay, Salvatore." She pressed harder, and he hissed through his teeth, "You're going to be fine. I'm not letting go." Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, growing louder, but Sofia would later swear the loudest sound in that diner wasn't the sirens, or the screaming, or even the second round of gunfire that shattered the register behind her. It was his voice, low and disbelieving, murmuring something that sounded almost like a prayer. "Nobody's ever done that for me." She didn't have time to ask what he meant. The world tilted. Hands, rough, urgent, belonging to the men in suits, pulled her back as paramedics finally shoved through the door, and the last thing she saw before she was hauled outside into the flashing red and blue night was Salvatore's hand reaching for her, fingers stretched toward the space she'd just occupied, like letting go of her was worse than the bullet in his chest. 3 days earlier, Sofia Bellandi hadn't known any of this was coming. She'd been exactly where she always was, behind the counter of Nana's diner, in a quiet corner of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, pouring coffee for men who tipped in loose change and complimented her cannoli more than they ever complimented her. She was 28, built soft and curved in a way her mother called abundanza, abundance, and she'd stopped apologizing for it the year she turned 25. She liked her body. She liked her laugh, loud and unguarded. She liked the way regulars lit up when she remembered their order without asking. What she didn't like was the ache of watching her family's diner slip further into debt every month, or the quiet dread that came with each unpaid utility bill taped to the register with her father's shaking handwriting on it. Pay by Friday, or they cut the gas. She didn't know that Tuesday morning when a stranger in an expensive black coat walked in and sat at table 6, ordering black coffee and asking, almost shyly, for a man who looked like he could break the table in half with one hand, what she'd recommend, that she was about to fall into the middle of a war she had no part in starting. She didn't know his hands, the ones that had gently taken the coffee cup from her like it was something precious, were the same hands responsible for controlling half the shipping routes on the East Coast. She didn't know the ink she'd glimpsed at his collar, dark lines disappearing beneath his shirt, wasn't decoration. It was a record. A history written in skin. One piece for every year he'd survived a world that wanted him dead. She didn't know that somewhere across the city, a woman named Chiara Genovese, the woman Salvatore was contractually, unofficially, dangerously engaged to, had already heard a whisper that he'd been seen smiling at a waitress in Brooklyn, and that whispers, in their world, had a way of turning into orders. All Sofia knew, kneeling on that diner floor with blood on her hands and a stranger's life in her palms, was that some invisible thread had just pulled taut between them, and there was no cutting it now. The hospital room Sofia woke up in didn't look like any hospital room she'd ever seen. The walls were the color of soft cream. The sheets probably cost more than her monthly rent, and there wasn't a single monitor beeping the way they did in the movies. Just silence, and sunlight, and a man in a dark suit standing by the door like a statue carved out of threat. "Where am I?" Her voice came out hoarse. Her hands, she noticed, had been cleaned. Someone had washed the blood off her fingers while she slept. "You're safe, Miss Bellandi." The man at the door didn't turn around. Mr. Rossi insisted. "Rossi." She sat up too fast, and her head spun. "Who's Rossi? My family owns a diner. They're going to think I'm dead. I need my phone." "Already handled." The door opened before she could argue, and the sight that filled the frame stole whatever she was about to say next. Salvatore stood there in a fresh shirt, one arm still strapped in a sling beneath it, and even wounded he filled the doorway like he owned the air in the room. Which, she'd come to learn, he essentially did. His throat was inked with lines that disappeared beneath his collar, dark and deliberate, climbing up toward his jaw. His forearms, visible where his sleeves were rolled, told the same story in ink, years pressed into skin, like a ledger only he could read. "You're alive," Sofia breathed, relief cracking through her voice before she could stop it. "Because of you." He crossed the room slowly, favoring his injured side, and lowered himself into the chair beside her bed, like it cost him something more than physical pain to sit that close. "Nobody does what you did for a stranger. Not in my world. You weren't a stranger. You tipped well and complimented my pie. That earns you at least a little bloodshed on your behalf." She meant it as a joke, but her voice trembled at the end, the adrenaline finally catching up to her, and to her own surprise, tears burned hot and sudden in her eyes. Salvatore didn't reach for her. He didn't crowd her. He simply stayed still, letting her have the moment, and something about that restraint, that quiet, controlled patience, from a man built like a weapon, undid her more than comfort ever could have. "You should know who I am," he said finally, "before you decide whether to hate me for what happened in that diner. I know your name is Salvatore. Salvatore Rossi." He watched her face carefully, like he was bracing for the flinch. "I run the Rossi family. If that means nothing to you, you're the only person in this city it doesn't." Sofia's stomach dropped, the pieces sliding into place. The men with guns, the private hospital wing, the total absence of police officers asking her questions. She swallowed. "You're Mafia." "I am." No flinch, no apology. Just fact, laid bare between them like a blade on a table. "And 3 men tried to kill me in that diner, because someone inside my own family wants my seat. You put yourself between me and a bullet, without knowing any of that. So now I owe you a debt I don't know how to repay." If this is the kind of story that makes your heart race, drop a comment below telling us where you'd have run, because Sofia, for all her fear, didn't run. "I don't want anything from you," she said instead, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, stubborn even now. "I did what anyone would have done." "No." His voice dropped, rough and certain. "You didn't. I've had men who swore loyalty on their mother's grave turn a gun on me for the right price. You didn't even know my name. And you put your body between me and death." His dark eyes held hers, unblinking. "That doesn't happen. Not to me." The silence that followed felt too big for the room, thick with something neither of them had a name for yet. "My family's diner," Sofia finally said, desperate to steer them somewhere safer. "I have to get back. My father can't run it alone, and if I'm gone too long—" "It's being watched," Salvatore said simply. "Protected. Nobody who wants to finish what started in that diner will get near your family. You have my word. I didn't ask for your word. I'm giving it anyway." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him she didn't need a mafia boss's protection, that she'd survived 28 years of a hard life without a man like him deciding her fate for her. But there was something in the way he said it, not as a command but as a vow, quiet and absolute, that made the words die in her throat. "Why me?" she asked instead, because it was the question that mattered most. You could have anyone, powerful men, connections, women who understand your world. Why does a waitress from Bensonhurst matter to someone like you? Salvatore leaned forward, close enough that she could see the faint scar cutting through one eyebrow, close enough to smell the clean, dangerous scent of him. "Because everyone in my world wants something from me," he said. "Money, protection, a name to attach to theirs. You looked at me like I was just a man who liked cherry pie." His jaw tightened, something raw flickering behind his eyes. "Nobody's looked at me like that since I was a boy." Neither of them noticed the shadow that passed by the hallway window outside. A woman in a tailored red coat, dark hair pulled back severely, watching the two of them through the glass with an expression that could curdle milk. Chiara Genovese had heard the rumors. Now she'd seen the truth with her own eyes, and in her world, truth like that came with a price. Chiara didn't storm into the hospital room. That wasn't her way. She waited until Salvatore had gone to speak with his men in the hallway, until Sofia was alone, sitting up in that too-soft bed with her hands twisted in the sheets, and only then did she let herself in, closing the door behind her with a click that sounded far too final for such a small sound. "You must be the waitress," Chiara said, her voice smooth as poured wine, her eyes sweeping over Sofia with the kind of assessment that made skin crawl. "Sofia, was it? Do I know you?" Sofia straightened, despite the ache in her ribs, some instinct telling her to sit up taller in front of this woman. "Not yet." Chiara moved closer, heels silent on the marble floor, every inch of her tailored and sharp in a way Sofia's soft curves and diner uniform could never compete with. Or so Chiara clearly believed. "But you will. I'm Chiara Genovese. Salvatore and I have been promised to each other since we were children. Our families built an empire on that promise." The words landed like a slap. Sofia hadn't asked, hadn't let herself wonder if there was someone else, but hearing it stated so plainly, so certain, made something in her chest twist painfully. "He didn't mention a fiancé," Sofia said carefully. "He wouldn't. Salvatore doesn't advertise obligations. He advertises loyalty and generosity and gratitude toward the people who bleed for him." Chiara's smile was thin, practiced, cruel underneath the polish. "You bled for him once. Congratulations. Don't mistake that for anything more than what it is." "And what is it? A debt?" Chiara leaned down, close enough that Sofia caught the expensive, cold scent of her perfume. "Men like Salvatore repay debts generously, and then they move on. You'll get a settlement, maybe a nice apartment somewhere far from Bensonhurst, and in 6 months you'll be a story he tells at dinner parties about the time a stranger saved his life." Her eyes flicked over Sofia's body, deliberate and unkind. Don't let yourself believe it's anything else. Women like you don't end up standing beside men like him. If you've ever had someone try to make you feel small for daring to want something good, comment below, because Sofia had spent years hearing versions of that same sentence, and she was done letting them win. Women like me, Sofia repeated slowly, and something steadied inside her, a spine she'd built brick by brick over years of being underestimated. You mean women who don't fold themselves smaller to fit someone else's idea of what they should look like? Chiara's smile faltered, just slightly. I don't know what Salvatore and I are, Sofia continued, voice steady now. And honestly, that's between him and me. But I didn't throw myself in front of a bullet for a payout. And I'm not going to shrink in front of you because you think my body disqualifies me from something you haven't even defined yet. So unless you have something useful to say, I'd like to rest. For a moment, Chiara just stared at her, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Not quite respect, but not quite dismissal either. Then her expression smoothed back into practiced elegance. Careful, tesoro, she said softly, straightening. This family doesn't forgive people who reach above their place. I'd hate for you to learn that the hard way. She turned toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. Ask Salvatore sometime what happened to the last woman who got too close to him without belonging to this world. Ask him about Elena. The name hit the room like a dropped glass, and then Chiara was gone, leaving only the echo of her heels and a silence that rang louder than any threat. Salvatore returned 20 minutes later to find Sofia staring hard at the far wall, jaw tight, arms crossed over her chest. You're upset, he said, reading her instantly, the way he seemed to read everything. Who's Elena? His whole body went still. For the first time since she'd met him, through gunfire, through blood, through a stranger's confession that nobody had ever looked at him kindly, Sofia watched Salvatore Rossi look afraid. Where did you hear that name? Your fiancé. Sofia's voice cracked on the word, more than she wanted it to. She came in here to tell me I don't belong in your world, and then she told me to ask you about Elena like it was a warning. Salvatore sat down slowly, heavily, the chair creaking beneath the weight of whatever memory had just settled over him like a shroud. Elena worked in one of my restaurants, he said finally, voice low and rough. 3 years ago, she wasn't involved in the business. She was just a hostess, sweet, funny, completely outside my world. We got close, too close. For a man who has enemies waiting for any weakness to exploit, his hands curled into fists on his knees. Someone found out, used her to get to me. By the time I found her, it was already... He stopped, throat working like the words physically hurt to say. It was too late. Sofia's anger drained out of her all at once, replaced by something heavier, sadder. Salvatore. That's why I don't let people in, he said, meeting her eyes with a rawness she hadn't seen from him yet. Not the controlled Don, not the untouchable boss, just a man carrying a decade of guilt in his chest. Every person who gets close to me becomes a target. I told myself after Elena that I'd never let it happen again. His gaze dropped to her hands, still faintly stained pink at the cuticles from 3 days ago, blood that hadn't fully washed away. And then you threw yourself in front of a bullet for me anyway. So what happens now? Sofia whispered. Salvatore reached out, finally, and closed his hand gently over hers, careful, like she was something he was terrified of breaking or losing. Now, he said, I decide if I'm brave enough to let you stay. Outside the hospital, in a car parked in the shadow of the building, a man Sofia had never met dialed a number and murmured 4 words into the phone that would set the next disaster into motion. She knows about Elena. The man on the other end of the phone said nothing for a long moment, just breathing, calculating. "Good," he finally said. "Keep watching. If Rossi's getting soft over a waitress, that's the opening we've been waiting for." 2 floors up, unaware that the war for Salvatore's empire had just found its next weapon, Sofia was released from the hospital with strict instructions to rest. Instructions she ignored within 24 hours, insisting on returning to Nonna's diner, where her father was drowning in a lunch rush without her. "Sofia!" Her father, Antonio, nearly dropped a tray of espresso cups when she walked through the door, curls tied back, a fading bruise still shadowing her collarbone. He crushed her into a hug that smelled like garlic and coffee grounds and home. "They told us you were attacked." "They told us men with guns. Sofia, what happened to you?" "I'm fine, Papa." She hugged him back fiercely, guilt twisting in her chest, at the fear etched into his face. "I promise, I'm okay." She didn't tell him the rest. Not yet. Not that the stranger she'd saved ran half the East Coast's underworld. Not that his enemies now knew her name. Not that somewhere in the city a woman in a red coat was already plotting how to remove her from Salvatore's life, permanently if necessary. She didn't have to wait long to find out how far Chiara was willing to go. 3 days later, the diner's front window shattered at 2 a.m. Sofia was jolted awake by her father's frantic phone call, and she arrived to find police lights painting the street red and blue, glass scattered across the floor like ice, and a single word spray-painted in red across the counter, where she poured coffee every morning. "Whore." "Who would do this?" her mother sobbed, clutching a broom like it could undo the damage. "We've never hurt anyone. We've never—" Sofia's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, no name attached. "This is your only warning. Walk away from Salvatore Rossi, or the next thing that breaks won't be glass." Her hands shook as she stared at the screen. She thought of her parents' faces, of the decades they'd poured into that diner, of a life that had nothing to do with guns or empires, or men with tattoos climbing up their throats like armor. And for one long, aching moment, she considered doing exactly what the message demanded. Walking away. Disappearing back into her ordinary life before any of this happened. Then Salvatore's car pulled up outside, and he was out of it before it had fully stopped, crossing the shattered glass in 3 long strides, his face carved from fury and fear in equal measure. "Are you hurt?" His hands found her face, her shoulders, checking her like he needed to see with his own eyes that she was whole. "Sofia, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her, cracking down the middle. "But my family's diner, Salvatore, they wrote, they threatened. I know." His jaw was iron, his eyes darker than she'd ever seen them. "I saw the message. It was sent to my people too. Someone wants me to know exactly who's responsible." "Chiara," Sofia said the name like a confirmation, not a question. Salvatore didn't answer immediately, and that silence told her everything. "I need you to listen to me," he said instead, voice low, urgent, his hands still cradling her face like she was something precious he refused to let the world take from him. "I am not going to let anyone touch you or your family. Not Chiara. Not the men who shot at me. Not anyone. But I need you to trust me, even when what I do next doesn't look like love. Can you do that? If you're the kind of viewer who believes love means fighting for someone even when it costs you everything, like this video before we go any further. Because what Salvatore did next would cost him more than either of them understood yet." "What are you going to do?" Sofia whispered. "What I should have done the moment you saved my life." His thumb brushed her cheekbone, achingly gentle for a man capable of such violence. "I'm going to end this arrangement with Chiara, publicly, tonight. Salvatore, That could start a war. Your families, the alliance, everything you told me about keeping the peace. Some things matter more than peace bought with a marriage neither of us wanted. His eyes bore into hers, fierce and unflinching. I've spent 10 years protecting an empire I never chose. I'm done sacrificing the one thing I actually want for it. Sofia's breath caught. And what do you want? He didn't answer with words. He answered by closing the distance between them and kissing her. Softly at first, like a question, and then deeper, more certain, when she melted into him instead of pulling away, her fingers curling into the front of his jacket like an anchor in a storm neither of them had asked for, but both of them were now standing in together. When he finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers amid the wreckage of her family's shattered window, he said the words plainly, without any of the polish or performance his world usually demanded of him. I want you, Sofia Bellandi. Curves and courage, and all the fire you've got. I want the woman who held pressure on my chest without knowing my name, and I want her enough to burn down every arrangement my family ever built if that's what it takes to keep her. Behind them, unnoticed in the chaos of police lights and broken glass, a black car idled at the corner. Chiara's driver, watching, already dialing the number that would deliver Salvatore's declaration straight back to the woman he'd just chosen to leave behind. By morning, all of New York's 5 families would know Salvatore Rossi had broken his engagement for a plus-size waitress from Brooklyn. And in their world, humiliation like that only ended one way. The call came at dawn, dragging Salvatore out of the first peaceful sleep he'd had in years. Sofia curled against his chest in the safe house he'd moved her family into overnight, her breathing slow and even, unaware that outside those walls, the city had already caught fire with the news of what he'd done. They've called a meeting, his consigliere said grimly through the phone. All 5 families. Chiara's father is calling it a broken contract. He wants blood, Salvatore. Or he wants the debt repaid another way. What way? Salvatore's voice was low, careful not to wake Sofia beside him. Her. A pause, heavy with everything neither man wanted to say aloud. They want the waitress removed from the equation, permanently, if you refuse to reconsider. Salvatore's blood ran cold. He looked down at Sofia, at the soft rise and fall of her shoulder, at the strength in her jaw even in sleep, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Set the meeting, he said. I'll go alone. Salvatore, alone, he repeated, and hung up before his consigliere could argue further. Sofia woke to an empty bed and a note on the pillow, his handwriting rough and hurried. Stay here. Trust me. I'll come back for you. I promise. She didn't stay. Sofia Bellandi had spent her whole life being told to shrink, to wait quietly, to let other people decide what she was capable of, and she was done with all of it. She found his second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Marco who'd been guarding the safe-house door, and planted herself in front of him with her arms crossed. Take me to him, Miss Bellandi. Mr. Rossi gave strict. I didn't ask what he said. I asked you to take me to him, or I'm walking there myself, and we both know that's more dangerous. Marco stared at her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his eyes, before he sighed and pulled out his car keys. The meeting was held in a private banquet hall on the edge of the city. 5 family heads seated around a long table with Salvatore standing at its center. Alone, exactly as he'd promised. Chiara's father, a stone-faced man named Dominic Genovese, rose first. You humiliated my daughter, he said, publicly, over a woman who works for tips in a diner nobody's ever heard of. I ended an arrangement neither of us wanted, Salvatore replied, steady despite the weight of 5 families' eyes on him. That's not humiliation. That's honesty. Honesty doesn't hold territory together. Another voice cut in. Loyalty does. And you've shown this family exactly how little of that you have left. The doors at the back of the hall burst open before Salvatore could answer, and every head turned as Sofia strode in, chest heaving, curls wild from the wind outside, looking every family head dead in the eye like she belonged there more than any of them. "If this is about me," she said, voice ringing clear across the marble hall, "then you should hear it from me, instead of deciding my fate like I'm not in the room." "Sofia," Salvatore started, alarm cutting through his careful composure. "I didn't save your life for territory or alliances or contracts," Sofia continued, ignoring him, addressing the table directly. "I saved it because a man was bleeding out, and nobody else was moving to help him. I didn't know he was a mafia boss. I didn't know about your families, your arrangements, any of it. I just knew someone was dying, and I wasn't going to let that happen while I stood there and did nothing." Her eyes swept the table, unflinching. "If loyalty means anything in this room, it should mean something for the people who show up when it costs them everything, not just the people born into a contract." Silence stretched taut across the hall. Dominic Genovese's jaw worked, fury and something almost like grudging respect warring behind his eyes. If you've made it this far in the story, drop a comment telling us if you'd have walked into that room too, because what happened next changed everything. "She has more spine than half the men at this table," said an older woman seated near the end. Isabella Conti, head of one of the oldest families in the city. A legend whispered about in circles Sofia had never imagined she'd stand in. "Dominic, your daughter didn't want this marriage any more than Rossi did. We all knew that. This performance of outrage is about pride, not loyalty." "This is not your business, Isabella. It became everyone's business the moment you called a war meeting over a broken engagement instead of handling it like adults." Isabella's gaze slid to Sofia, assessing, and something in her expression softened. "Sit down, Dominic." "There will be no blood shed over this. Rossi made his choice. Let him live with it, and let the rest of us return to matters that actually threaten this city's peace." The tension didn't vanish. Not entirely. Dominic's glare promised this wasn't truly finished, that Chiara's wounded pride would smolder somewhere in the shadows for a long while yet. But the immediate threat, the blade hanging over Sofia's head, lifted just enough for both of them to breathe again. Salvatore crossed the hall in long strides the moment the table began to disperse, pulling Sofia into his arms without a single care for who watched. "You could have been killed walking in here," he murmured against her hair, his voice raw. "You could have been killed in a diner 3 weeks ago." She shot back, muffled against his chest. "And here we both still are." He laughed then, a real laugh, rough with disbelief, the sound of a man who hadn't let himself feel lightness in years. He pulled back just enough to look at her, tucking a curl behind her ear with a tenderness that belonged to no one else who'd ever seen him in that hall. "Marry me," he said, quiet enough that it belonged only to them, not for territory, not for an alliance, because you walked into a room full of men who could end you, for me. Because you make me want to survive this life instead of just running it." Sofia's eyes filled, her hand pressing flat against his chest, right over the scar the bullet had left behind, the same place her hands had once pressed to keep him alive. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Salvatore." Outside the banquet hall, the city kept moving, unaware that a plus-size waitress from Brooklyn had just walked into the heart of the Mafia and walked out having rewritten her own story, not as a footnote in someone else's empire, but as the woman standing beside its king. If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone who needs a reminder that love finds the ones brave enough to fight for it, and subscribe for the next chapter of Sofia and Salvatore's world, because their story is only just beginning.